a portfolio of stuff that is really, really fun and really rewarding. And so a couple of things about what it's been like. Because I'm doing all those things, I created a personal card wall to try to keep track of what it is that I'm working on. So essentially a Scrum board or a Kanban wall in order to keep track of all that stuff. I can tell you that business is like bananas. It comes in bunches. And right now it's coming in bunches, and I'm flying up to Portland every week for part of a week to be interim VP of engineering for a drone fleet management company in Portland. And at the same time, I'm scheduling Agile training, and I'm scheduling another interim VP engineering role, and I'm doing some other Agile training, and I'm mentoring some VPs of engineering. And it was a lot lighter earlier in the year, and I have time to schedule in time to go see my 1-year-old and 3-year-old grandkids in Seattle. And that part's been really wonderful. And I absolutely love it. There have been a couple of FTE roles that I have liked a lot, and this is at least a match for, if not better than that. I've monetarily made what I made as an FTE, or between that and half again more over the last 5 years. One more thing I want to say. Oh, and everything I do is fractional, which I think is also different than both of you. Mostly. Yeah, so no one gets more than half of my time. And that's not true on a weekly basis, but it's true if you look at any quarter, nobody gets more than half of my time. And I established that as a rule very early on, and it's worked really well for me. When you're hired in as a VPE, I discovered over the course of the previous decade that people stopped listening to you after about 2 weeks. When you're a consultant, it turns out they're continuing to think about whether they're going to pay you or not. And you get a performance review with every paycheck. And it's one way of looking at it, and they just keep doing that. And there's another piece, which is they're going to fire you sooner or later. I mean, we're there on contracts, and so it's a lot easier to speak truth to power. So with that, I think I will turn it over to either of you to talk about your experience.
Sure. I'm glad he went first. Gave me a chance to think about what I might say, and I'll tell you a couple of high points, and I'll try to be quick about this. I've had 3, I would say, really major full-time jobs. I was employee 45 at MIPS, and both an engineer and a manager. And I ran Solaris for Sun, brought them to the quarterly release model, did ZFS zones, dtrace, blah blah blah, all that innovation. And I started my own company called Graphite Systems, which was a big freaking computer that had, huge bandwidth to flash. And those are probably the 3 big ones. And then in between, I consulted. And so if you think about okay, what were the things battling in my brain along the way? The first was, do I want to be an employee or not? And I will tell you, after MIPS, I didn't want to be an employee. And so I went off and I was a consultant. And I mostly did, for the longest time, I did development. And then Apple said, okay, why don't you be a director contractor? And the folks at DEC, who I was doing software consulting for, also at the time were just depressed because I was going off to do management. And I went back and forth, like Ron, a bunch of times, and the last time I wrote code was 2 years ago, and I wrote a database from scratch because none of the databases really respected the Intel architecture, which we'll be stuck with for another 10 or 20 or 50 years. And so we got, incredibly fast performance, and I wrote a huge amount of C code. Again, I've written Java, I've written, C, blah, 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 all those things. Oh, I also wrote our test infrastructure in Python. So I did a bunch of that stuff just 2 years ago. So I've had this, employee, non-employee, developer, manager. I've gone back and forth of those things. And so in the second shot, so how did I become like mostly a manager consultant or a VP consultant was I got divorced and I had half custody of my daughter. I didn't have time to do it. I was in a startup. I had a deal with one CEO that I got to work at work 4 days a week and home 1 day a week, and had some bandwidth to deal with my daughter. I really liked the interview because the CEO was late because he had his kid at a soccer tournament. That didn't last. He was replaced, and so was I. And so that's when I decided to go off and try to do consulting so I had more time for my daughter. It was plain and simple. And that's when I really ended up doing that. But I want to go to something Ron said. You get to speak truth as a consultant, right? So you go and you say, look, here's the way I see it. I suggest you do this. My opinion is this. If they don't take it, like, who cares, right? You don't own their stock. You don't care about their salary reviews. It's none of that stuff, right? It's impunity, right? And I've been lucky along the way, and I don't have to work every single day. I can't retire, but I don't have to work every day. And so I really didn't care if somebody said, okay, we don't like what you have to say, go away. And they almost never said that. But I'm an acquired taste, and I'm pretty honest about it when I go in. I've been fired 4 times in my life, okay?
And we can see why. No.
Yeah. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, and when I go in and I talk to somebody now, it's either people I know, because Dun & Bradstreet calls me probably every 2 years and says, how can you run a business when your phone number is not listed? You don't have, you're not reachable. Like, how do you do this? It's all word of mouth. It's people who've worked with me before and want to work with me again. And, sometimes they bring me in as the hatchet man, and I'm willing to do it. And sometimes there's, you talk about challenges, there's debates between the people funding and the people running the company, and I'm usually paid for by the people funding the company. And so there's all sorts of challenges along the way, and I will say that I've made some mistakes along the way too as a VP of Eng who's interim, and the biggest one is throwing my hat in the ring to be the permanent VP of Eng. Mixing those two is bad. It's a permanent judgment by the people who are working for you and the people you're working for, and so I stopped doing that. And then, I went off and did this big company, and then I went off and had my I would say most rewarding job of my life. And Debbie and Ron know this. My wife passed away of cancer last year, and I took care of her 24/7. And she was a psychotherapist, and she and I used to joke we do the same job because managing engineers is quite interesting. And she would point me at things by David Burns, a very famous cognitive behavioral therapist, and he's very practical. So, okay, so what do you do about procrastination? He has a chapter on it, right? So she, after watching me do this through our marriage, she said, please never ever take a management job again, either full-time or as a contractor. Just don't do it. And so she passed away, and a friend of mine called and said, okay, why don't you come and talk to me? And the first thing you want to do is hand me a 1,000-person organization. I go, I'm not ready for this. You're not ready for this. You haven't prepared your organization. They actually like the guy that's there. They didn't like him because he wasn't delivering, the usual thing. And so I said, okay, let me go do an evaluation. So Debbie and I both do these things, evaluations, due diligence, mentoring, the same stuff that Ron does. But usually, I have a major contract that I'm doing. And so they kept me on, and then they had me help them with a big contract with a bank. And the people were all in India and Germany. So my boss, who ran the whole organization, said, go in and pretend you're me. And I said, okay, and what happens if they don't want to listen? He goes, send it to me, I'll deal with it. Like, really? So I'm running about, $12 million project, 100 people, half in India, half in Germany, from my PJs in my den. And my dogs love it, and I love it because I'm not managing anybody. I'm directing a project. at kind of the executive level, and I still do hey, if it were me, I'd do this, except they know that if they don't do it, my boss is going to deal with it. So I'm enjoying that. I probably could do this the rest of my career. I definitely, I think both Debbie and I have gotten stock in companies, and sometimes that pays off, and sometimes it doesn't. The rate of pay is pretty reasonable because you go into really awful situations, and if things blow up, you get taken out. And it's really no different than a full-time gig, but at least you kind of know that's going to happen. And then I think the other thing, the last thing I'll say is it also presents you with interesting downtime. If you end your project anytime after about May 15th, you aren't really working until mid-September because people are gone for the summer, right? And so I've gotten to do things like write a book, and there's a book there, and it's actually been a good business card for me. Nothing more. And I haven't made money on it. It's a good business card. Yeah. And I've built an office for my wife because they didn't have a waiting room. I wrote a book of poems. So there's a book of poems out on Amazon that you can read. Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you. And so I've done a bunch of those kind of things along the way because I've had 3 or 4 months, and I always kind of treat it like a job, and I go find something to do and have some fun. But I love this gig, and it's been a lot of fun.
Over to me.
Over to you.
I'm not sure how far I should go back. I mean, I sort of stumbled into consulting. So I was an engineer by training, math and computer science, wrote software for a handful of years, worked at Bell Labs a long time ago for a short period of time because I paid for my master's degree, but when they really were a monopoly, came out here, worked for Logitech when they were just getting started. So I tended, after Bell Labs, I was kind of a startup person, right? So I worked at Logitech. I was the first American they hired in the day. Went to Metaphor Computer Systems, which was a spin out of Xerox PARC in the early 80s. I was a working software engineer for a handful of years, but I was the engineer with interpersonal skills. So I was promoted into management early on. I was a team lead, I was a engineering manager, I was a director. Honestly, most of my life, I managed men who were way older than I was because I was the young engineer with interpersonal skills. Then I ended up leaving Metaphor, got a VP job at a startup called Slate in the high-flying, high-falling, pen-based industry. Then I stumbled onto Collabra Software. I was VP of engineering there, and we were Netscape's first acquisition in late '95, right after they went public. So I ended up running